The whispering walls, welcome to the inferno. Imagine walking down a spiral stone staircase, torch in hand, the air thick with dampness and secrets. With every creaking step, the temperature drops, the light dims, and the walls seem to lean in, not metaphorically, but as if they genuinely resent your presence. Welcome to the castle dungeon, the medieval equivalent of both a timeout corner and a career-ending meeting. Only this time, you don't get a passive-aggressive warning email. You get shackled in a room that smells like regret, mold, and last week's prisoner. Dungeons weren't just spaces to stash a drunk noble or the occasional sheep thief. They were engineered nightmares, precision-crafted to deliver maximum fear with minimum sunlight. Think less prison and more psychological experiment gone wild. Here, whispers weren't rumors. They were tactical blueprints. Suffering wasn't collateral damage. It was the brand. And darkness? Oh, it wasn't absence of light. It was curated, like a fine wine or a suspicious HR policy. Let's talk architecture. These weren't some accidental basements where the servants tossed junk. No, dungeons were integrated into the core of the castle, usually directly below the lord's quarters. Why? Because nothing says sweet dreams like the muffled screams of your enemies. The walls were impossibly thick, built not just to hold sound in, but to make sure the suffering inside reverberated just enough to fuel palace gossip. Everything echoed pain, secrets, betrayal, like medieval ASMR, but make it horrifying. Many dungeons had multiple levels. The higher levels? Mild discomfort. Maybe a cell with a straw bed, if you were lucky or noble. But go deeper, and you enter the designer hell zone. Their rooms got smaller, colder, and the air thicker, sometimes deliberately flooded or gas-choked. Some had trapdoors in the ceilings, Iron Maidens in corners, or drains in the floor that weren't for rainwater. These weren't features, they were messages. Messages like, do not cross the Duke, or this is what happens when you question church taxes. And the sound design, oh, it was art. Doors didn't just creak. They screamed like banshees. Chains weren't just restraints. They were psychological sirens. One prisoner rattling his cuffs could ruin sleep across 3 chambers. That was the point. The dungeon was a community event for the terrified. More than that, these dungeons were multifunctional. Torture chamber by night. Secret council room by later night. In the absence of trust, pain became proof. Oaths were sworn under duress. Deals struck over moans of agony. You didn't just get imprisoned here. You got rewritten. And for the ruling class, this wasn't evil, it was efficiency. Why waste time with paperwork when a quick session with the rack could get you loyalty, confessions, and land rights, all before breakfast? This wasn't chaos. It was curation, a carefully crafted ecosystem of despair. Even the rats knew their routes. So as we descend into this world of blood-stained diplomacy, bone-crushing negotiation, and whisper-thick politics, remember, these dungeons weren't forgotten rooms. They were deliberate tools. The real throne, it might have been beneath your feet. Comment if your office air conditioning also feels like engineered medieval punishment. Like, share, and for the love of sarcasm, follow the channel, because next, we're exploring the blueprints of terror in Chapter 2. Brick by brick, how the dungeon became a secret meeting room. Castles were not just homes for royals and their egos, they were power hubs. And beneath the silken tapestries, opulent banquet halls, and dead-eyed portraits of people who probably poisoned their cousins, sat something more sinister, the dungeon. But here's the kicker. It wasn't always about torture. Sometimes it was about trust, or more specifically, the complete and utter lack thereof. Medieval politics made modern office politics look like a kindergarten playdate. You didn't just schedule a meeting with your enemy. You lured them into a stone chamber, had them shackled, and then maybe you talked. It was corporate negotiation with iron chains instead of coffee. These subterranean chambers weren't just afterthoughts. They were strategic, intentional, and terrifyingly functional. The idea was simple. Keep your enemies close, and your torture instruments closer. Beneath the castle, alliances were tested not with words, but with veiled threats, psychological warfare, and the occasional demonstration of a stretching rack. Let's start with the layout. Dungeons were typically built beneath the keep, the castle's strongest and most heavily guarded section. Not only did this protect prisoners from escape or rescue, but it also served the dual purpose of intimidating guests. Would you like a tour of the grounds? No? Then perhaps a seat in the negotiation chamber, right next to the brazier. Privacy was guaranteed by feet of stone, winding corridors, and acoustics that ensured no one above could hear anything clearly. Just enough sound leaked out to inspire anxiety. Conversations conducted here weren't casual. They were rituals. Carefully choreographed discussions where each participant knew that any wrong word could lead to a very permanent kind of demotion. Lighting played its part. Torches flickered and cast long shadows that moved like ghosts. The scent of mold, blood, and unwashed secrets filled the air. Every item in the room was both decor and declaration. Shackles on the wall, thumbscrews on the table, a whip on a hook. Nothing was ever used unnecessarily. The implication was enough. It was a decor style best described as Gothic intimidation meets corporate blackmail. Even the seating arrangements told a story. The Lord always stood, looming over whoever was invited to the meeting. The guest often sat chained, or at the very least, uncomfortable, forced to negotiate from a literal position of submission. The power imbalance wasn't subtle, it was theater. Historical accounts tell us about these meetings cloaked in darkness. In France, certain barons would call rival nobles to resolve grievances in rooms lit by a single torch. In Italy, entire family alliances were restructured under duress, with contracts signed using quills held by trembling hands. In the Holy Roman Empire, whispers carried more weight than proclamations. One of the most iconic cases remains that of King Edward I of England. The Tower of London, under his reign, was less a jail and more a diplomatic sledgehammer. The presence of torture gear wasn't incidental. It was invitation-only ambience. Rebels were detained not always for punishment, but to negotiate terms. Those terms just happened to be more agreeable after a brief introduction to the rack. And then there were the secret councils. Small, torchlit gatherings with only the most trusted or expendable members present. Maps drawn in dust. Treasonous thoughts air behind stone and steel. These were places where political destinies were rewritten, sometimes literally carved into walls. The scent of sweat, fear, and damp parchment filled the air while treason got poured like wine. Let's not forget the bureaucracy. Ledgers, documents, even oaths sworn in blood. All kept here, not in libraries or courts, but deep underground, where they could be locked away with the person who signed them. The dungeon was also a filing cabinet. A very angry, very damp filing cabinet. This wasn't just political maneuvering. It was performance art. Diplomacy, horror edition. A reminder that in the medieval world, you didn't just need armies to win a war. You needed a chair in the right room. Preferably one not soaked in something ominous. Next time someone tells you history was boring, remind them that medieval CEOs hosted board meetings surrounded by iron shackles and torture racks. Nothing says sign here like a thumbscrew demonstration. Tag someone who'd run HR in a dungeon. Like, share, follow the channel, because the blood is just beginning to boil in Chapter 3. The silence that screams, punishments with a purpose. The silence that screams, punishments with a purpose. Forget everything you think you know about medieval punishments. This wasn't just a chaotic frenzy of sadism. No, it was far worse. It was organized, calculated, purposeful. Every whip crack and bone snap was a line item on the ledger control. Castle dungeons didn't just house criminals. They engineered obedience. In the medieval worldview, pain wasn't simply punitive. It was persuasive. Rulers didn't merely want subjects afraid of death. That was too quick, too final. They wanted people to fear surviving punishment, to return to society as broken reminders of royal authority. The real terror began after the chains were removed. Let's talk tools. The rack, a deceptively simple contraption. 2 rollers, a frame, some rope, but when cranked, it transformed limbs into stretched sinew and snap joints. Screams weren't side effects. They were strategically useful. They echoed down corridors, seeping into the dreams of anyone nearby. These were audio warnings to stay obedient. Then there was the pair of anguish. a metal device inserted into various orifices, then expanded via a screw mechanism. The result? Damage both internal and psychological. It wasn't designed to kill. It was designed to humiliate, disfigure, and prevent silence. That's right. The mouth version was reserved for liars and blasphemers. Speaking the wrong words could get your jaw shattered. The Iron Maiden, romanticized today as a staple of horror museums, was a true nightmare. A standing sarcophagus filled with spikes, built not always to kill, but to threaten. Many victims were shown the device, not using it. Its presence was psychological warfare, like a blade hung above the throat. Always ready, never needed. Scaphism. Now, there's a word to ruin lunch. This Persian-inspired method involved trapping the victim between two boats, feeding them milk and honey, and letting insects handle the rest. Yes, medieval Europe took inspiration from older, darker corners of the world. If you were very unlucky and your punishment was meant to send a message, this method would be tailored with European flair. Maybe buried in castle muck pits or left outside chapel gates as a divine warning. And then there were the auditory horrors. The heretic's fork, a metal rod strapped between chin and chest or chin and sternum, keeping the head still and forcing total silence. Speak, and the spikes drive in. This wasn't a punishment for the body. It was an assault on the soul. Some victims were forced to wear them while paraded through villages. Nothing says don't question the church like a living sermon of pain. Silence itself was weaponized. Solitary confinement in pitch black. Soundless cells turned strong men into babbling wrecks. Imagine days, weeks, months in darkness, with nothing but your heartbeat and the occasional echo of someone else breaking down. Medieval dungeons weren't just physical places. They were psychological torture chambers. What made it worse? Most of these punishments weren't reserved for assassins or war criminals. They were often for dissenters, tax protesters, adulterers, people who looked at the wrong noble the wrong way. Many were preemptive punishments, given to someone not because they had betrayed, but because someone thought they might. Branding was also key. A hot iron to the face or hand left permanent proof of sin. Some carried letters, T for thief, H for heretic, B for betrayer. Not only did this dehumanize the victim, it enlisted the public in the punishment. These individuals were ostracized, denied work, and sometimes hunted. Punishment didn't end in the dungeon. It walked among the people. Torture was so bureaucratized that some castles kept ledgers. Who was punished, how long, what method, and whether they screamed. Some torturers developed reputations, known not for brutality, but for efficiency. The dungeon master was not a maniac. He was often a manager. Let's not forget Gilles de Rais, the infamous French noble who turned his dungeon into a theater of horrors. His crimes were beyond grotesque, but what's instructive is the structure of it all. Rituals, order, messaging. His victims weren't random, they were statements. Fear was a schedule. Now, picture yourself dragged down damp stairs for failing to pay tithe. A hooded man greets you. You smell iron and blood. Tools glisten. There's a stool, but you're not allowed to sit. They don't yell. They don't explain. The silence speaks. And when you return, if you return, you're not just wounded. You're rewritten. Flash forward to today. Fluorescent lights hum above. You're called into a meeting room with a frosted glass door. Your boss smiles too long. There's no coffee. No one speaks first. Your contract is on the table, redlined. No blood this time. Just deadlines. It's not a dungeon. But your soul knows better. Punishment, ancient or modern, is rarely about justice. It's about performance. About showing everyone else what happens when the rules get bent. A theater of pain, with just enough survivors to fill the audience. Comment with the modern punishment you'd outlaw if you were king. Like, share, follow the channel. Because Chapter 4 is coming, and we're talking about dirty secrets and darker pacts and cursed contracts, deals signed in blood and fear. Cursed contracts, deals signed in blood and fear. Beneath the damp stones and rotting beams of medieval dungeons, not all screams came from agony. Some came from hesitation, some from betrayal, and some, perhaps the most dangerous, came from silence right before quill scratched its first line across a blood-stained contract. Welcome to the world of cursed agreements, oaths under duress, and treaties forged where the air smelled like old bones and older secrets. In medieval politics, trust is as rare as soap, which meant alliances couldn't be built on good faith. They were built on leverage. And nothing gave leverage like a dungeon beneath a castle, the original pressure cooker. Here, contracts weren't negotiated. They were extracted. Lords, bishops, even princes were brought to discuss terms with shackled hands and the distant sound of boiling pitch. These contracts weren't symbolic. They held weight, sealed with blood. Sometimes literally, they bound kingdoms together or ripped them apart. Picture this. Two rival noble houses at war for generations, suddenly agreeing to a ceasefire, but only after one heir spends 3 weeks in the oubliette with nothing but a rat and his father's disappointment. Suddenly, diplomacy makes a lot more sense. The ink was often not just metaphorical blood. It was actual blood, and sometimes the parchment was skin, human, animal. It didn't matter as long as it could hold a curse. There were entire chambers dedicated to oath-making with relics, bloodletting knives, and scribes who moonlighted as torturers. These were not documents. They were damnations on vellum. Some castles went further. They built contract rooms specifically for ritualized submission. The room was often octagonal, symbolizing eternity or divine binding. A stone altar stood in the center, lit by hanging braziers that filled the air with smoke and incense. One corner might hold a reliquary, bone fragments of some martyred saint, just add divine weight to whatever devil's deal was being written. In these rooms, a notary sat behind a stone desk flanked by guards. The person signing might be forced to kneel, and the writing implement was often dipped into their own blood. The room had no windows, and no one ever asked for a second copy. One infamous case is the Oath of Ashes from 14th century Poland. A vassal lord suspected of planning rebellion was dragged into a dungeon where he was presented with a document ceding all mineral rights from his lands. When he refused, the guards brought in a brazier filled with hot coals and shoved his hand into it. The burns were so severe he could barely hold the quill, but he signed with a charred hand. That same contract is said to have been found in the archives of Krakow centuries later, still marked with flaking blood and the stench of cooked flesh. Clerics were often present not to bless, but to bind. They invoked the wrath of heaven as contract enforcement. Phrases like, "May God strike down he who breaks this bond," were not metaphors. Sometimes, a bishop's ring was used to press a seal into the hot wax, symbolizing divine witnessing. In truth, most of these priests were as politically motivated as the nobles they served. God's name was good business. More chilling still were the contracts written with death clauses. Agreements that, if broken, required the signer to surrender a child, a spouse, or a body part. And yes, teeth were a common currency. A noble might leave a dungeon smiling less, but loyal forever. Even more terrifying were the psychological contracts, the ones based on shame and silence. Agreements where the real threat wasn't torture, but exposure. Sign, or we read these letters aloud in cathedral. In a society built on honor, reputation was currency. A ruined name could be worse than a severed hand. Some of the most unstable treaties in European history were forged in these environments. The Treaty of Erfurt, for example, was signed by a trembling Frederick III while locked in a monastery dungeon. That treaty later triggered 3 civil wars. Because when a man signs away peace while rats nibble his boots, he's not exactly thinking long-term. And not all contracts were political. Marriage pacts were also sealed in dungeon cells, especially when the bride was less than thrilled. These forced unions were often made with fathers looking to climb the feudal ladder and daughters with no say. A girl might be brought in sobbing, seated across from a stranger and told, "You will say yes, or stay here." Now imagine this. You're brought into the HR office. It's dimly lit. There's a contract on the table. The manager doesn't speak. You're offered a pen and a suggestion to sign before Friday. You glance at the walls. No torture tools, but plenty of framed motivational quotes. You sign, you leave, and you wonder, what exactly did I just agree to? Because power hasn't changed. It just got a facelift. The screams now echo in silence, in unread clauses and the slow, irreversible unraveling of freedom you didn't know you surrendered. Comment with the worst deal you ever had to sign. Like, share, follow the channel, because in Chapter 5, we're going deeper into betrayal as a family sport in The Betrayer's Chamber, when your kin locks the cell door. The Betrayer's Chamber. When your kin locks the cell door. Betrayal stings. But betrayal from your own blood? That's a wound with no clean edge, just rot. In medieval dungeons, the grates didn't just close on enemies or outlaws. Sometimes they slammed shut because your brother turned the key, your mother whispered your name, or your cousin really wanted your land. Welcome to the dark tradition of familial backstabbing, Castle Edition. These weren't accidents. They were strategic betrayals, carefully planned with dinners, fake hugs, and poison goblets. Because when it came to consolidating power, bloodlines were business plans, and family was just another liability. The dungeon, in this context, wasn't merely a place of punishment. It was a final family gathering. The cell became the courtroom, the execution chamber, and the last place you'd hear your surname spoken with any ounce of warmth. And the worst part? It was often done with a smile. Let's talk about the Plantagenets. Ah, yes, medieval England's favorite dysfunctional dynasty. King Henry II's sons rebelled against him more than once, sometimes while literally under his roof. His wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, no slouch herself, was imprisoned by Henry for over 15 years in various castles. Romantic, right? One of the most powerful queens in history, spending years under armed guard because her husband didn't like her political opinions. And her sons? They weren't so much heirs as they were contestants in a blood-soaked royal version of Survivor. Consider Richard the Lionheart and his brother John. John tried to seize the throne while Richard was away during the Crusades. John's betrayal was so profound that it became legend and inspired more than a few overly dramatic family sitcoms centuries later. When Richard returned, he forgave John publicly. Privately, it said John never slept without guards again. Then there's a legendary story of Ivan the Terrible. Sure, he's Russian, but his brand of family-friendly cruelty fits the theme. In a rage, he killed his own son, the heir to the throne, striking him in the head during a quarrel. The palace turned dungeon in a single moment, proving that the walls don't have to be stone for betrayal to echo. Many castles had secret holding rooms, deliberately placed near the lord's quarters, not for enemies, but for relatives. Discreet imprisonments, soft betrayals, just until the inheritance is sorted, or while we discuss the marriage proposal. And of course, those rooms rarely needed names. Everyone knew who they were built for. Imagine being a younger brother to a duke. You share everything, meals, tutors, a dog. Then one night, you're woken by armored guards. No explanation, no struggle, just a polite escort down cold steps to a chamber with a cot and a door that locks from the outside. Your crime? Being second in line with a better smile and more popularity at court. And maybe your sister-in-law likes you a little too much. This wasn't limited to the male side of history either. Noble daughters were often locked away by their fathers or brothers to prevent inconvenient romances or rumors. Some never resurfaced, erased from the family tree by silence, brick, and a conveniently placed wall. Lady Eleanor de Clare, niece to Edward II, was locked in the Tower of London not for treason, but because her marriage threatened someone's land claim. Dungeons were also the go-to solution for disputed inheritances. Picture a scenario: a patriarch dies. The will is unclear. One heir argues legitimacy. Another claims seniority. Instead of lawyers, you get guards. Instead of court, you get a cell. The argument ends when one sibling signs over rights under duress, and the other celebrates with a feast upstairs. There's a case of Count Ugolino of Pisa, who, along with his sons and grandsons, was locked in the tower by a fellow noble and left to starve. Why? Politics, of course. But the betrayal was uniquely cruel because it involved generations. Children grew hungry beside their fathers. It was a slow-motion execution, masked as justice, soaked in familial venom. Dante immortalized Ugolino in Inferno, where he gnaws eternally on the skull of his betrayer. Even monasteries weren't immune. Wealthy families often sent problematic sons to the church. And when that didn't work, a quick reassignment to a cloistered dungeon kept the shame away from public eyes. These were not just betrayals of blood, but of destiny, ripping someone's future away and locking it in a cell. It wasn't uncommon for rebellious heirs to suddenly take vows of silence, because silence was enforced with iron. And what of mothers? History gives us tales of women forced to choose between sons, pressure to testify, or manipulated into silence. There are records of noble women signing over lands after their children were imprisoned, contracts inked with tears and leverage. In some cases, matriarchs orchestrated the betrayal themselves, seeing one son as a better investment than another. The heart breaks, then sharpens. One chilling example: Isabella of France, known as the She-Wolf of France, who helped depose her husband Edward II, effectively handing him over to his captors. His eventual death, gruesome and suspicious, with a family affair executed with chilling efficiency. Now leap forward. Imagine being called to the boardroom. Your cousin sits across from you. The contract on the table is a restructuring. The security guard at the door is purely a formality. You read the fine print. You're out. And she smiles. Modern betrayal wears a suit and comes with an NDA. But the heart of it, the coldness, the calculation, is straight from the dungeon. It doesn't take stone walls to make someone disappear. Just a signature and a smug grin. Comment with your most awkward family betrayal. Keep it legal. Like, share, follow the channel. Because next we plunge deeper into the mirror of modern cruelty in medieval management, when office politics feel like dungeon rules. Medieval management, when office politics feel like dungeon rules. Welcome to the office. The fluorescent lights buzz with existential dread. The coffee machine drips with a sluggish pace of doomed ambition. And across the room, your manager's smile is just polished enough to hide the dagger. You've walked into a meeting, but it feels like entering the throne room of a paranoid baron. And why wouldn't it? The modern workplace is less a center of productivity and more a reenactment of medieval power games, just without the chainmail, unless it's a startup. Let's start with the architecture. Open plan offices? That's just a great hall, where your every move is public, every conversation can be overheard, and every snack is judged. Cubicles? Miniature oubliettes. Soundproof enough to feel alone, but open enough that you're never safe. Conference rooms? The modern equivalent of judgment chambers. Glass-walled, cold, silent. You're not called in for brainstorming. You're called in to be evaluated. In medieval times, power was asserted through pageantry and punishment. Lacking Instagram, lords relied on heralds and heads on spikes. Today, the office has Slack channels and quarterly reviews. Same tension, same fear. Instead of execution, it's performance reviews. Instead of exile, it's we're going a different direction. Now consider the hierarchy. In a castle, you had the king as advisors, the knights, the peasants, and the dungeon keeper. In the office, it's the CEO, the C-suite, middle managers, interns, and HR. Think HR is there to protect you? Think again. In medieval courts, the priest blessed the torture. Today, HR blesses your exit interview. Let's talk about the new instruments of pain. In the past, the rack, the stocks, the whip. Now, the KPI spreadsheet, the calendar ping at 4:59 p.m., the passive-aggressive just checking in, follow-up emails. Instead of screaming, you're smiling through gritted teeth while updating your resume in incognito mode. Performance improvement plans? The modern equivalent of being told to dig your own grave. No one says it, but everyone knows you're being watched closely until your digital beheading is scheduled for Friday at 3. Rituals abound. Morning stand-ups resemble sermons. Let's align expectations sound a lot like confess, and you might be spared. Every check-in is a confession. Every status update is a public trial. And just like in the courts of old, your silence is often more suspicious than your guilt. Medieval courts were run on fear, alliances, manipulation, and control of narratives. Now replace nobles with department heads, and you've got the exact same setup. Information is currency. Transparency is illusion. Gossip is gospel. You hear of layoffs first from Brenda at the copier, not from leadership. Punishment are more psychological now, but no less cruel. Removed from key projects, exiled. No invite to the strategic planning meeting, ostracized. Public praise for your teammate, while you're left off the deck, humiliation. The gallows is now a Google Doc. Corporate feasts, welcome to the all-staff party. The king throws a banquet, but the real message is, observe who sits at my right hand, who gets called out in the CEO's quarterly email, who gets the good swag. Watch closely. These are the new titles of nobility. And promotions? Forget merit. Just like in the Middle Ages, they're often a result of alliances, timing, or the mysterious disappearance of your superior. One day you're the loyal scribe. The next, you're inheriting their seat after they transition to new opportunities. Even office decor reflects a dystopia. Inspirational posters replace stained glass saints. The Employee of the Month wall is a shrine to survivorship, and the break room fridge, a battlefield. Food theft, territorial Tupperware wars, and passive-aggressive notes that rival medieval edicts. The modern meeting is the dungeon of discourse. Glass walls, no escape, a screen casting data like scripture, and someone always asks, what are your blockers? As if your soul wasn't already halfway out the window. So when CEO says, my door is always open, picture the king gesturing toward a room full of spears. And when your manager wants to circle back, remember that's what medieval soldiers did before striking again. The office isn't a revolution of work. It's a recreation of control, refined, sanitized, but still echoing with every whisper from those stone corridors. Comment with the most medieval corporate ritual you survived. Like, share, follow the channel. Because in Chapter 7, we'll ask the real question, why are we still obsessed with dungeon culture? In Echoes in the Stone, why the darkness still speaks to us. Echoes in the Stone, why the darkness still speaks to us. Close your eyes. Picture a dungeon. Cold, wet, silent. Now ask yourself, why does it feel so familiar? Why does this bleak, suffocating place, built to suppress, torment, and erase, still echo in our modern imagination like a beloved childhood storybook? We haven't outgrown the dungeon. We've integrated it into our culture, our systems, our psyches. The medieval dungeon wasn't just a structure, it was a symbol of unchecked power, of suffering made sacred, of secrets carved into stone. And for all our technological progress, we haven't exorcised the ghost. We've simply redecorated it. We see it in entertainment. From Game of Thrones to The Witcher, dungeons appear not just as settings, but as catalysts, places where truths are revealed, where characters are broken or reborn. They serve as narrative pressure cookers. Darkness sharpens a plot. Pain clarifies motive. Children hear fairy tales of princesses in towers. Adults binge series about confinement and redemption. The motif persists, evolving with our fears. The dungeon has become a mental construct, a metaphor for depression, for bureaucracy, for societal stagnation. It no longer needs chains. It only needs limits. Even architecture betrays this obsession. Government buildings with windowless rooms. Corporate HQs with lower levels labeled restricted. Hospitals with psych, wards buried in silence. The dungeon is rebranded, but never removed. Let's go deeper. History's most powerful regimes use confinement not just for punishment, but for rewriting identity. Think of the Bastille, the Tower of London, the Gulag. Each had stone or steel, yes, but more importantly, each had narrative control. Who went in, who came out, what they became. That's why the dungeon still chills us. It doesn't just imprison, it redefines. Now turn inward. Consider therapy, self-help, personal growth. What are we really doing but revisiting our own internal dungeons? Locked memories, buried traumas. We descend, confront, and if lucky, emerge with fragments of ourselves reassembled. Healing is a jailbreak, and it's rarely clean. And socially, we have digital oubliettes, cancel culture, deplatforming, shadow banning. You step out of line, not always with malice, sometimes with honesty, and suddenly you're not just silenced, you're erased, buried under algorithms, screaming unheard. Then there's the economic dungeon. debt, poverty. Systems so layered and deliberate that escape feels mythic. We talk about financial freedom as if it were a castle to storm. And for many it is. Why do we keep returning to the dungeon in stories, in dreams, in fears? Because it speaks to something ancient, the journey inward, the test of endurance, the trial by darkness. Myths from every culture included. The hero descends into the underworld, not for punishment, but for knowledge. We fear dungeons because they isolate, but we also crave them because they reveal. What's left when you strip away light, comfort, distraction? You, just you, and whatever truth you've been avoiding. And the silence? It's not just the absence of noise. It's the sound of your mind, finally unmasked. The dungeon persists because it mirrors our most primal transformation, from ignorance to awareness, from innocence to understanding. It is the crucible, the reset button, the mirror we don't want, but need. So next time you feel trapped by circumstance, by emotion, by someone else's narrative, pause. Look around. Listen. You might be in a dungeon. But if you are, that means you're on the brink of discovering something powerful. Comment with your dungeon, real or imagined, that you escaped. Like, share, follow the channel. Because the stories locked in stone still have more to tell, and we're just getting started. Blood in the blueprint. How dungeons still shape power today. The stones may have crumbled, the chains rusted, and the screams faded, but make no mistake, the blueprint of the dungeon still lives. Not just in architecture, not just in memory, but in the very systems that dictate who moves freely, who speaks loudly, and who disappears in silence. The dungeon didn't die with the Middle Ages. It evolved. It professionalized. And in doing so, it became harder to see, and therefore more dangerous. Today's dungeons are crafted from policy, paperwork, and a weaponized kind of indifference. They're embedded in our institutions, schools, hospitals, prisons, corporate offices, detention centers. No drawbridge, no chains, just biometric scanners, waiting rooms, locked doors with employees-only signs, and invisible rules no one explains until you've broken them. Let's start with solitary confinement, arguably the most direct descendant of medieval isolation cells. A punishment so psychologically shattering, it has driven people to madness, hallucination, and suicide. A person can be kept in a windowless box for 23 hours a day for months, sometimes years. No trial, no timeline. It's called administrative segregation. In medieval terms, it's the oubliette, literally, the place of forgetting. Next, immigration detention centers. They're surrounded by fences, lit 24/7 by fluorescent lights, monitored by surveillance cameras, and governed by shifting, obscure laws. Detainees wait for days, weeks, months, sometimes with no lawyer, no charges, no sentence. Bureaucracy replaces torture, but the message is the same. You are not welcome, and you will be forgotten. Even public schools can echo dungeon logic. Metal detectors, armed guards, isolation booths for disruptive students. Some schools look more like correctional facilities than places of growth. Disobedience is not met with dialogue. It's met with confinement, expulsion, or labels that follow kids into adulthood. These aren't schools. They're training grounds for docility. Then there's corporate infrastructure, the sleekest dungeon of them all. Open floor plans that feel like panopticons. Surveillance software that tracks keystrokes and bathroom breaks. Promotion ladders designed like traps. Flatter your overlord. Say nothing controversial, and hope no one notices your burnout. HR meetings feel like tribunals. NDAs are signed like confessions. Flexible work means you're always available. Wellness programs offer breathing apps while ignoring suffocating workloads. Digital life? That's an algorithmic oubliette. A tweet, a post, an unpopular comment, and you vanish. Deplatformed, shadow banned, ghosted by code. You didn't break a law, but you violated a community standard, and now the community no longer sees you. It's modern exile, and no one has to swing a sword. Perhaps the darkest dungeon is the one built from invisibility. Marginalized communities by race, gender, disability, immigration status don't need bars to feel trapped. Systems do the job just fine. Medical neglect, policing patterns, wage gaps, Cultural erasure. If you are excluded from access, voice, and visibility, you are imprisoned. Only the cell is statistical. This is not conspiracy theory. It's architectural reality. Look at city zoning maps. Redlining. Food deserts. Infrastructure deserts. Entire neighborhoods designed to limit mobility, access, safety. Poverty becomes topography. Prejudice becomes concrete. Dungeons weren't just for punishment. They were built to send messages. You don't belong. You don't matter. You will be made to disappear. That message persists, now encoded in algorithms, policy, urban design, and economic models. But dungeons, for all their terror, are never absolute, because humans, even in chains, whisper, plot, resist. In medieval times, rebellions were planned behind cell walls, smuggled letters, carved markings, hidden songs. Today, resistance looks like community bail funds, whistleblowers, mutual aid, underground journalism, art that burns through censorship like torchlight through cobwebs. The blueprint survives, yes, but so does defiance. The question is not just who controls the locks, it's who remembers the way out. So when you walk through a checkpoint, ask, who built this gate? When you fill out a form that asks too much, ask, who profits from this data? And when you feel small, unseen, silenced, remember, dungeons were designed to make you forget your voice, which means remembering it is the first act of rebellion. Comment with the hidden dungeons you see in the world today. Like, share, follow the channel. Because the next series will expose the mechanics of power we've normalized and the keys we didn't know we already held.